checked all my dates and things, because I'm sure to get them wrong.
My dear, mine aren't so
More
good
tea?
anymore. Yes, please. More tea.
Okay, so you were original faculty member at Juilliard. How did you know Mr. Houseman or Michelle Saint-Denis? How did you come to know them, or how did you come to be hired for the drama division?
I didn't even know who John was. But I was traveling on the train from New York to Poughkeepsie to go to my job at Vassar with Rhoda Levine, who was a dance teacher. And she said to me, John Houseman is founding a theatre department, a drama department at Juilliard, and he's looking for someone to teach voice. You should get in touch with him immediately. And I said, but I don't know who he is or where he is or whatever. So she gave me a number and I called it thinking, well, this is, dead end. And I got an appointment to see him. He took me to tea somewhere, I think. Oh, no, he took me to the plaza. Yes, he took me to the plaza. And we sat there and he grilled me. And I thought, oh, well, I've just done that in. And to my amazement, I got a call the next day from his secretary asking if I was interested. And he told me later that he'd interviewed another very famous voice teacher, far more famous than me, but she wanted to also have a foot in the dance department. And he said he didn't want any people who were jack of all trades. So, and I was obsessed because he's sneaked in a question about dance. And I said, oh, I don't know anything about that. I love it, but I know absolutely nothing about it. Voice is the only thing I think I know a little bit about. And he said, that's why I hired you. So that's how I got the job.
But weren't you at Yale, or were you at...
Yep.
You were at both?
I was teaching at Yale
and
at the same time, and at Vassar, and at Juilliard. I was like a travelling salesman of voice. And Mondays, I used to leave the flat in the afternoon, go to Poughkeepsie, teach in Poughkeepsie. I mean, it was really crazy. Yeah. And then I also had a job at the neighbourhood playhouse. So I taught every day of the week, practically, in a different place.
But then when you went to Juilliard, you just...
A couple of years.
Oh,
a couple
really?
of years.
But that was before Juilliard?
That was before Juilliard. That was pre-Juilliard. Because although John asked me if I was interested, I didn't actually go there for a few months, So yes, it was amazing. I mean, it was very good for me because I hadn't been teaching for long. I was only just older than the oldest people in my classes.
And what was your experience, if you weren't teaching, where did your life begin in the theatre, as an actress?
No, unfortunately. It's the only thing I wanted to do. And when I left school, I had this idea that I would audition. Well, I discovered very quickly that I had absolutely no talent. So the alternative, and I had to have an alternative because I had to earn my own living, was teaching. And so I started out teaching in ghastly places like a Catholic convent in Ilford, Essex, and a secondary mod school down the Old Kent Road, which is below grammar school. Anyway, so that was my teaching experience prior to Juilliard.
No, hadn't you been at RADA?
Oh, I taught at RADA, yes, I forgot about that. Wouldn't RADA be angry to know that I'd forgotten them, my God. Yes, I did teach at RADA. In fact, it was from RADA that I came to America because the students at RADA kept saying, you should go to America, you should go to America. Nobody does what you do. And that's what sort of kicked me over here.
And so when you taught at Juilliard, you taught voice. Can you unpack what teaching voice entails?
How long have you got? No, I'm serious. It's much more involved, I think, than most people realize. because there's so many different aspects of it. There's the anatomical and physiological, then there's the emotional, then there's the mental, then there's just physics of sound, then there's acoustics, then performance, and all this comes out of a particular shape. Everybody's a different shape. Everybody's vocal folds are a different thickness and a different length. So there are all kinds of unknowns. So what goes into it? Oh, well, obvious things like breath is very important. Absence of unnecessary tension is very important. There's got to be some tension, though, or you'd just be a heap on the ground. You have to take into account what is dear to people. I mean, their family background, the influence of their mother on their speech and voice, culture, their peers. I mean, it's a very varied tapestry that you're trying to unpick and reweave in some way. But you don't want to change it. You don't want to make that person's voice not part of them. So you can't have some vague standard and just impose that on people. You have to have there are certain things that you must observe. Like there are good ways of breathing, there are terrible ways of breathing. Terrible ways of breathing can lead to vocal damage. No way of breathing leads straight to vocal damage.
So what is a good way of breathing and what's a terrible way of breathing?
Well, a terrible way of breathing is to lift the whole rib cage vertically so that your shoulders come up and the rib cage is lifted like this with no expansion, just a lift, so your lungs don't fill properly. So what doesn't fill properly can't empty properly. And since when you talk, when you make voice, when you make sound, you make it with what comes out of you. In other words, the outgoing breath. If that isn't pretty good, you're in trouble, right at the bottom of the pyramid.
And when you, so with all these different aspects of voice, and you had different actors, how would you teach a class with all these varying different degrees of, personal background, of technique? I mean, how did you unify it in a single course?
It's really hard. It's really, really hard because it takes quite a long time. That's why you can't do it in a few weeks or a few months or even a couple of years. I mean, I reckon 4 years is about the amount of time you need. How many people have the opportunity to have a class for 4 years? But at Juilliard, we did. I mean, the fourth year, they were really thinking about performing and they couldn't have cared less about the classes. But that's what you need because it's very, very slow. First of all, you have to get some idea of who they are, what goes into their makeup, what they think, what they believe, what they want to do, what they would like to be able to do. There are all kinds of things. It's a huge, huge pot. And you're kind of stirring it up, which isn't always nice for them. It's disturbing, it's disorienting, and that's when you have to be careful. And I think in retrospect, I often stirred much too vigorously because I wanted everybody to really reach the best that they could possibly be, in terms of how it would serve them in the profession.
Didn't you have them on the ground breathing for 2 years?
Oh, certainly, yes.
How often?
Used to start every class with some kind of physical work, basic stretching and bending and moving. And then down on the ground and then just breathing with the diaphragm, ribs. You can't breathe so well with the ribs lying on the ground because when you breathe, the back of your rib cage has to expand as well as the sides. And if you're lying on the ground, the back isn't going to expand. So you're not dealing with every part of it, of the ribs. So that was, and that's boring. That's really boring.
Well, it's not boring, but how? So how was the voice program structured at Juilliard, or how were the courses? How did you design what you did in the first year into the second year? If you could give an overview of that, that's probably helpful.
Well, the first year would be very, very simple exercises. Though I used to feel that it was my job to make them interested. Not all voice teachers believe that. I mean, there are some people at Juilliard who say it's their responsibility to be interested. And, so I felt that it was on my shoulders to somehow make it interesting or make them realize how important it was going to be to them in the future, in the profession, that they should have a voice that was strong and flexible, expressive, diction that was clear. And that, again, that's very tricky because everybody has their own speech pattern, their own background, their own dialect, accent, whatever you want to call it. And if you strip that away too much, it's like getting, under the nail. It's tender there. So you have to be careful. But basically, you start with the body and with breath, then with what's called placement, which means getting it out. This is very basic. Through an open mouth instead of talking between your teeth and bottling everything up in your neck, which creates an enormous amount of tension. And then you start working on range. Range is the last thing, because again, that's so tricky because you don't want to make people sound artificial, going up and down for no reason whatsoever, just to be interesting. I mean, that's rubbish. So it's very tricky. It's really, really difficult.
And how, when you were teaching, were there times where you bridged that with their acting courses, where you would, how was the application? I guess that's handled.
Well, you try to find material that you can use in your class that will bridge the gap between the voice class and what they might have to do in rehearsal. So it falls into two broad categories. You do stuff that's concerned with technique. I mean, if they have to fight and talk at the same time, you devise a set of exercises that are going to help them to do that. If they're messengers and they have to run in Greek plays and then drop to their knees and deliver great speeches, then you devise exercises that are going to help them do that. Having picked the exercises and sort of analysed it from a technical point of view, then you have to find material that echoes all that, or has those problems embedded in it, and then you get them up and you get them doing it. And here's where you have to be really careful, because you're beginning to deal with acting, which is an absolute no-no. I mean, voice teachers are not supposed to talk about acting, but you can't avoid it. Because a voice devoid of that is just an empty sound. So you have to watch your step. And that's hard. So teaching voice is like balancing 100 plates in the air.
And so you were leading a department. Who else was working with you in the voice?
Robert Neff Williams, who was much more experienced than me. And he came from, he hired me to go to the neighborhood playhouse. And he took a real risk because I was fresh off the boat, as it were. And he didn't know if I could do it or not, but he hired me and said I was to do diction or speech. And I said, but I can't do speech because I don't speak American. He said, yes, you can. You can just do diction. You can just do articulation and consonants. So that's what I spent my first year doing here. And then I think Sandy Meisner realized that there were a couple of people working on words and language and speech, and he got very nervous. So he fired Bob. He fired Robert. And I felt I had to support him, so I left too.
Where was this again?
Which was pretty crazy, but I did. But then I ended up at Juilliard, which was so much better in every possible way. You probably have to cut most of this.
I will. But I mean, you're bringing up something that's actually important, which other people have talked about. I mean, the group theater and Adler and Meisner and Strasberg, which that's a whole nother book, which we won't get into.
There's a new book about the method.
Yeah.
I want to get that.
I do too. I heard the interview on the radio, but that was a different way of training. I mean, could
Yes.
that was, I don't want to speak for anyone in that world, but about spontaneity, and it was about life experience, etc., from their learnings, perhaps, or impressions from Stanislavski. So what was going on at Juilliard that certainly intention and objective and all of those things were inherent to the training, and talking to Michael Kahn, that was, apparent to him. But how did you handle situations like that when there was sort of this pedagogy or approach from Meisner and the rest that wasn't about technique or anything that was technical?
It's interesting because Juilliard actually attracted a lot of criticism for being too technical, particularly with voice. Our voices were too good. They were too good, right? Mm-hmm. That was the charge that was leveled again. NYU was better for acting. And it's true, NYU was a much gentler, more tender place, I think, than Juilliard. We were in those days, we were very demanding, very demanding. I mean, it came from the right place, but we were.
Go ahead.
So
Jim.
how did you bridge that gap? That was that's the next answer. The next part of that question is so interesting. What did you do when you came upon someone who worked with a teacher, or you're talking about teachers or directors, right? Who were sort of anti-technique in a way?
Yeah, or someone like Kevin. I mean, he's a perfect example whose career, one that doesn't know him might say the hallmark is spontaneity or improvisation or something, but he's a very gifted technical actor.
Oh, very.
I mean, so
Very.
certainly I would imagine that the actors from that era that grew up in the 60s and the 70s were, heard of Klurman and heard of Adler and Strasberg, and, did they ever drift towards that? Was it ever hard to keep them more technically aligned?
Because I don't think they would have gone to Juilliard if they had been more interested in that side of acting. I think whether they recognized it or not, wanted the discipline of it. I mean, they certainly wanted to be able to do a lot of different things, I think.
Like Shakespeare.
Yeah.
So let's hold that thought, because I think we'll come back to it in a second when we talk about the acting company. So then the first group becomes the acting company, and they all have for lack of a better phrase, a shared aesthetic, or they had the same training.
Yes.
How did you and Michael and Mr. Hausman and Boris and others who were with the company now bridge? What was the difference between their training and their development? I mean, how did you look at a production when you would watch or listen to it and help coach it or adjudicate it and treat the students as professionals? Or was it the same because it was the same material?
You mean when they moved into the acting
Yeah,
company?
when they moved into the acting company. When suddenly there was the audience, they were touring the country. So there was because it just seems to me that in reading all the reviews and in talking to Margot and everyone else, that the comments and all the notices were how clear their productions were. I mean, and that has to be attributed to you and your colleagues.
No colleagues. She had no colleagues.
Okay, no colleagues. But I mean, did you approach it differently? It's okay if you didn't. When, if you're at Saratoga and you were watching the school
because it was
scandal.
like an extension of Juilliard.
Okay.
Certainly for the first few years, until we had people coming into the company who were not Juilliard trained. Then it became much more a thing of trying to bridge the gap, which you mentioned.
Which is my next question. How did you do that when the first group left after 4 or 5 years and you started to
Well, because they went on these fabulous tours, which did that. That's what bridged the gap. Mm-hmm. The acting company tours as young professionals. They were equity members, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So they were professionals. But it was, and they toured everywhere. So they had all kinds of different audiences. And so that, showed them that what we had been trying to teach them was actually important. And if they tried it out, it might work, might make life a little easier.
Yeah.
Professionally.
Lose their voices.
What?
They wouldn't lose their voices.
Right.
If
I
they
mean,
did it right.
Like young doctors do no harm, voice teachers do no harm. You know, you have to be really careful not to go and mess things up.
What do you mean by that?
Well, give the wrong kind of advice, give the wrong kind of exercise, insist that somebody should do an exercise which is not right for them. I mean, very often you'll give someone something to do and it doesn't sit well. And if it doesn't really sit well, you have to change it, I believe. Otherwise, you know, you can run into further trouble. Yes, there's a great thing about how do you protect your voice. I remember we had a brilliant actor in the first years of the acting company who ran into terrific vocal problems.
Who was that?
Mary Lou in Mother Courage.
Right.
And I said to John, she shouldn't go on tonight. You have to put her understudy on. Happened to be Harriet Harris. This is just for us now.
Yeah.
John said, I can't do that. I said, you have to. You want her to lose her voice? You want her to really damage her voice, which is already compromised from birth? And he was furious with me. I went to the theatre in time to do the warm-up. And John was there in the stage manager's office, changing into a suit or something. So I went in. He was at one end changing. I was at the other end, getting into the clothes I was going to do the warm-up in. We did not exchange one single word. He was so annoyed with me. So we did this in complete silence, walked out.
And who went on that night?
Harriet Harris.
Yeah, but more importantly, when we first opened the company, who went on in School for Scandal the opening night? Dakin Matthews instead of David Schramm. Do you remember that?
No, I don't. I don't.
How could you forget
Schramm
that?
lost his voice?
Yes.
Wow, I don't remember that. Good Lord.
Talk about John. I'm gleaning on this idea
Gleaning?
that when the voices fail, suddenly technique matters, even if you don't believe in it, right? That if you that the needs for the technique become clear to the people who grew up and who were trained
Because that's how you don't
out of
lose your
emotions
voice.
and feelings and sense memory stuff that I learned about and actually took a class using that once upon a time. And then suddenly when you fall apart, you actually need to learn technique, even if you...
Well, that's the Gielgud quote, right? Technique is for the nights that the rest of it doesn't happen. Or I'm paraphrasing probably, but I think that's something like that.
But of course, Jean is on the side of technique, or is sympathetic to that,
Well, the
because
dance world
being
never
a
gave it up.
dancer,
A lot of the
different.
dancers never gave it up. There were some that have, but a lot of dancers haven't.
But you wanted to get into clarity, is that?
Yeah, so let's talk about text. Let's jump into text. I'll make this easier because we'll start in a simpler place. I remember when we did a handful of productions very happily together. One of which was Romeo and Juliet. In the Friars opening, Grey-Eyed Morn, first
yes.
time, there's a line about the type of plant he's bringing on, and I remember you circled the word, and I believe and inserted the word willow instead. It's some archaic word, I can't remember now, but you said willow will be clearer. The osier. Osier cage, right?
Osier.
So,
yes.
and I remember you said to me, well, no one's going to know what that means. You should insert the word willow, because that's what it in fact means. And you had so many amazing substitutions, and we did Hamlet together and As You Like It, and I'm sure from all of your extensive career, anyone would say this. Some of it's just experience, but how would you know when an archaic word would take the audience out of it, and how would you know when the archaic word was important to keep?
That's a terrific question, actually, because you do have to be careful. You can't just change everything. Some people would criticize that and say that you're dumbing it down if you change a word. You shouldn't change a word. But I do believe if it obscures the sense, if it puts yet another block between the audience and the actor, then you should do something to try and get around that. Because after all, it's a partnership, it's a collaboration. You have a bunch of actors up there, you have a bunch of people down here, the audience. There's got to be some connection between them. Otherwise, nothing works. And if they can't understand it because they don't understand the language, which is always a problem with Shakespeare. It is. I mean, I love him. I would work on Shakespeare for the rest of my life.
As would I.
And do nothing else. But it is problematic, and sometimes very problematic, because sometimes he was very lazy, shall we say. He didn't go back over things. He didn't make sure that things sort of matched up. Sometimes he just wrote at such speed that it's hard to follow. And other times, of course, he did all those things on purpose. There's a marvellous speech, a fantastic speech in, the Duke, disguised as the friar. And he is practically incoherent. And you think, what? What's this? Shakespeare, what are you doing here? And it's because he's pretending to be a friar and he doesn't really know the vocabulary and he doesn't know, quite how to express friar-like thoughts and feelings. And so Shakespeare's written this speech, which is really uneven and difficult and strange. And at first you think it's just a load of old wallop, But it isn't. It's very clever. It's really, really, really clever. Because it shows you, here's a man who's pretending to be someone he's not, and he's getting all tangled up because he doesn't know the language, doesn't know what words friars use.
Yeah, and I mean, it's a beautiful example of that he always, not always, as you just pointed out, but most of the time, characters said what they were thinking. It was living thought, and it was on purpose, and everything mattered. And I remembered, in all the productions we worked together, that was always true of what you said to everyone and said to me as a director. I'm going to switch a little bit into the idea of different types of language. So many, when we think about Shakespeare, most people think about iambic pentameter, which we can come back to that in a second.
Oh boy!
But
how seldom it is regular. How seldom it is.
Well, let's
regular.
start there then. So why don't just very briefly before we talk about irregularities in iambic pentameter? What is iambic pentameter? Can you just
ba-dum 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 ba-dum?
Okay, and what is irregular?
Irregular or regular?
Irregular.
Had I been there that I'm a silly woman, that probably is. Oh, Lord. There are so many.
We'll come back to that if you want.
What is irregular?
Well, you can intellectually explain it. I mean, what does it mean when something's irregular?
Well, it's not a regular beat. It's not a short, long, short, long, short, long, short, long, short, long. It's long, short. Oh! Then, if I were a... So the O is strong or long or whatever you want to call it. And then the next one, the next syllable is short or weak. So the first word catches you.
That's irregular.
That's irregular, because instead of being ba-bum, it's bumba.
And so, I'm asking these questions, hopefully this book, we're trying to have a larger readership than just the theater audience. So how many beats are in a regular line of verse?
Regular pentameter, 5 and 10 syllables.
Mm-hmm. And irregular could have multiple...
Could be 11, which is an Alexandrine. 1 syllable too many, which misogynists used to call a feminine ending because women always say too much. I don't think anybody dares to say that now.
And so you would teach this, right? Was this part of your portfolio when you were teaching at Juilliard, or did?
Yes, but it wasn't what interested me most. I would only go into it if it reflected something, some raising of the emotional temperature, some problem that the speaker had come up against that they couldn't solve, something. Because, it's like the heartbeat. Our heart doesn't just go ba-dum, 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 all day and all night. If you're startled, if you're angry, if you're afraid, if you're overwhelmed, it changes. You can feel it.
And so, and I know this from working with you, that we wouldn't get too hung up in that unless it's what you just said, if it opened up something for the actor. So how did many actors would get hung up in, their paper would be full of marks.
Yeah.
And how would you help an actor who maybe had overly thought those things and the only thing you ever heard was ba-dum, 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 and there was no blood or no life in what they were saying?
No, you try and get at it through the language, I guess, because the sound of a word, the weight of a word is very often a clue. I mean, that's what makes Shakespeare so great, that he understood all this. He just knew it.
Whoever he was.
And it's extraordinary.
So I'm an actor that's been in school, been badly trained, and just remembers the iambic pentameter. What do you say to me?
What did you just say? I'd say, what did you just say? That's what I would
Then
say.
I'd say it again.
And then they would do it again.
Badly, probably. Maybe.
And I'd say, well, what do you want me to hear when you say that? What does you want me to understand? How do you make me understand that? Which are the words that are meaningful to you? Why did you choose that word? Why did you choose that word as opposed to another word?
So you would probe their thinking.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
if they're not thinking, you can
tell them.
Suggest.
But often, and I, again, as being your friend and having gone to the theater and working on plays together, sometimes when people can't understand Shakespeare, when I mean the audience, it's actually maybe due to overemphasizing words. So talk about how does that happen?
Oh, it's a wish to be clear. It's a wish to be really, really clear, and it's a lack of empathy, I think, with what's going on in the moment-to-moment acting, Well, it's the same in speaking. You're speaking from moment to moment. It's not... So I saw two major actors recently, and I was unbelievably disappointed in what I saw and heard. And it shocked me. It upset me more than I can tell you. And I don't think anybody's noticed. That's what's so sad.
And was that because they were not clear, they didn't understand what they were saying, or what?
No, they just reduced it to nothing. They reduced it to nothing.
Well, they yelled and raced. They thought they were doing something. They were speaking loud.
Two major actors.
And fast.
Two major actors.
Loud and fast, so they thought they were saying things.
This part's just for us. I promise this won't go in the book. What production was this? In Shakespeare or on television?
Yep, it was Denzel and Fran.
Oh, in the movie. Yeah.
I mean, oh my God, I couldn't believe it. I was looking forward to it.
Yeah.
Because they could have been fantastic together.
I thought parts of that were actually interesting, the way they teed it up, and then it kind of...
The filmic parts were cool.
Yeah. Well,
I like the witches.
Oh, I love those birds of prey.
oh, yeah. There were some great images. And
They
I thought
were
the
marvelous.
Lennox was kind of... That was...
I thought some of the smaller
Yeah, there was
The
what's his name?
the smaller parts were better.
Yeah, Ross and
They were
Lennox.
much better.
On the
Let's go back for a second. Well, did you see, real quick, sidebar?
But you mustn't put that in.
I won't. I promise I won't.
They'd have my guts for garters. They would.
Oh, I won't. Did you see John Douglas in Merchant of Venice?
No, I'm afraid not.
Yeah,
I was going to watch it. I think I was just too tired or something.
Did you make it?
Oh, no, we drove into New York and we turned around and drove back, remember?
You're not
Well-
supposed to tell me.
well-
Why did you do that?
it doesn't matter. Listen, but
How was he? Was he good?
he
He's wonderful. I think he's one of the best
it was
Shakespearean
so
actors.
clear.
Yeah.
But what happened? And again, that I can't say this is a contemporary of mine who's a much more successful director than I am. She didn't direct the rest of it, and when he wasn't on stage, the whole thing fell apart because. So in the whole end of the play, it just
really?
you were literally the whole audience. You could feel it.
She used not to be like that. I knew her when she was starting out, and she was really good.
I don't. Some of it was the casting. I have to say that there was the Portia. It's so difficult against him, and they cast someone who went to Juilliard, but I think has been doing a lot of television. I forget her name, and wasn't up to it, and it was really difficult. And they forgot it was a comedy. But anyways, let's go two more questions, and then I'll let you. Then we're done.
No, I don't think you've focused enough on clarity and why that was so important to the acting company and why that was made us what we were.
Well, let's talk. So yes, I mean, reading.
Got enough on that?
Well, let me ask one more question, maybe around it. How do you note a production when you're? How do you listen to an audience, or how do you listen to a play differently once the audience is there? When you're in previews or you're in performance and you're taking notes on your note cards, how? No, I mean that fondly. I mean it's because they're perfect. They're clear, concise notes that you can hand anyone. I mean, does it change or not at all? I mean, do you help the actors communicate and have their antennas up to the audience? You know, how do you get them to help hear what the audience is hearing?
Oh,
Or is that the job of the director?
I hope it's the job of the director.
Let's talk. We talked about poetry. Let's talk about prose just for a second, because when everyone hears Shakespeare, they immediately jump into iambic pentameter, and you and I both know that prose is very tricky.
Yeah.
Can you explain what prose is, just in a very rudimentary form, in Shakespeare?
Well, there's a sort of tradition that the basic workaday, ordinary people scenes are mostly in prose. Anything that has very heightened emotion or some sort of aristocratic context is in verse. Now, that's pure snobbery, of course, but there is a difference. There is a difference. If you get verse in the kitchen, for example, it's very... Jack and Jill went down the hill to fetch a pail. It's that level. But if poetry in the above stairs, or when emotions are very raging, is incredible. It can be lyrical, it can be brutal, it can be all sorts of things. But for argument, prose is somehow better suited, I think, because it's not so erratic.
Mm-hmm. Meaning that
Better suited to what?
Better suited than poetry?
To argument,
Because it's not...
because it's not so erratic.
But you mean poetry is more erratic?
Oh, I think so. Yes.
because in prose, whether it's prose isn't. I guess I'm probably wrong about this, but it has sometimes what you mean about argument isn't fighting. You mean your if it's Oliver, let's say, and
Rational thoughts.
Yeah.
Rational.
I see.
Anyway, it's hard. It's very hard to talk about these things because you begin to sound dogmatic, and you just can't.
Well, you don't. But let's just say you're a play like As You Like It, which has a mixture of prose and verse.
Yes.
What would you say to an actor, if assuming that a good, well-trained actor would know what to do with prose and verse, the difference and when it flips. But how would you help them if you're looking at the prologue in As You Like It, or the epilogue, whether it's Rosalind or What would you just say in sort of general terms? Here's a chunk of prose that starts a play.
Oh, like, the start of As You Like It.
Yeah.
Well, I'm a great believer in instinct, which is, I suppose, begging the question, because there's no doubt that some people have more of an instinct for verse than others. Why, I wonder? I once asked somebody about this, and they didn't know the answer either. I think, quite honestly, and I thought about this a lot, but when I was at school, we had to go on Sundays to the local cathedral and sit through, the morning service matters. So we heard the King James Version of the Bible. Every week we heard that. Every week we heard the Psalms. And it gets into you. I don't know, you play furtive games with your person sitting on next to you, you try not to fall asleep, all these things while it's going on. But every week, week after week after week after week after week, you heard this glorious language. And it's by osmosis, it does something. So I think you start a little bit ahead of people who perhaps have not had that experience. Even though I, resented it at the time, I'm quite sure that that's what stayed inside me. Because I do believe that these things live inside you. Yeah. And then, you're faced with a context, a moment, a play, a conversation, and it brings it out.
It's beautiful. It's really well said, Liz. We've talked a lot about training and development. Let's talk. I would be remiss if we didn't talk about the rest of your very esteemed career. I mean, you've probably coached, after you taught, many of them, the most celebrated actors of the 20th and 21st century in one thing or another. How do you handle, coaching really, experienced, well-known actor as opposed to someone just starting out? Is the approach different, or?
Yes, because you can assume they know how to work. You ask them how they would like to approach this. I wouldn't do that to somebody just out of school. I would ask another kind of question. I've been very, very, very lucky. I've only had a few instances where I've met a block so strong that I couldn't find any way around it. But if you ask somebody if there's anything that's on their mind, they usually tell you, quite honestly, well, I always have trouble with, and if they say, I've always had trouble with, your heart sinks because you think, oh dear, that means that you haven't really wanted to find a solution. That's probably not true, but you do get taken aback a bit if they say,
yeah,
I always have trouble with.
So part of your job is also to instill confidence so they can...
Oh, God, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, think about what an actor does.
Yeah.
Or, any kind of performer. You're out there in front of hundreds, now thousands of people.
And we can hide in the back. And,
and you're actually going inside yourself and bringing stuff out. I mean, it's a very vulnerable position. Very.
I have a question. Is it, are all voice teachers, which you were, capable of doing this? I mean, this is different than teaching voice, what you're talking about now. Making, when you work on a play and you're working on, I mean, what we're talking about now, about making things clear, about understanding what the playwright is saying, so that you know what you're saying. That's different than teaching voice, isn't it?
Oh, gosh. I don't know. I think it's all part of the same thing, isn't it?
Okay, all
I
right.
think of it as coaching,
But it's
kind of personal coach trainer with voice and text.
I don't know. I can't think about it like that.
okay.
I think you're probably right. Coaching is different.
Well, coaching
Maybe
has
we're talking about coaching now.
coaching has time attached to it, right? You only have the audience is
And
going to
also
show.
it's a much broader field. If you're teaching a voice class, this again is what is so difficult. You are asking people to change. You're asking them to step off what is really normal and natural for them and safe. You're asking them to begin to sound different. Why? Why? What right have you to do that? So you have to make sure that you're right about this, that they need to do this, otherwise they won't be understood. They need to do this or they're going to lose their voices within the first week of rehearsal. They need to do this or they're going to sound unbelievably boring. They need to do this because if they break everything up after every 2 or 3 words, they're going to lose the sense. They're going to lose the thought. So you have to bring all this into the teaching
They
of
have
voice.
to be heard.
And they have to get a job.
And to be heard. And to be heard.
And get hired. That's another, the background to all of that, right?
So it's very difficult. It's very, 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 very difficult.
Can I jump back to this? I don't want to interrupt.
Did you have another question?
No, I have one more thing, but let's go back to
Just
this.
thought about working with the famous, the established actors. As a footnote to that from my distant hearing about it is that because they're so established, there's a huge amount of fear. So the stakes are so high that it strikes me. I've heard from Liz talking about this that they're actually can be even more resistant to what Liz might be able to offer them than a young person whose the stakes are so much lower. It's that sometimes you say no.
No.
They're not
It's
resistant.
funny. It's actually funny. People who are just out of school or within the first 2 years are much more resistant. They resist. Famous people, mature actors with experience are much more likely. I've had famous actors say to me, tell me exactly what it is. I will decide how much of that is helpful. But just give me everything.
Right.
A young actor will say, but you're asking me to change who I am.
Right.
Or, I don't want to sound different.
Right. Interesting.
Or something else, you know? It's funny, but it doesn't work the way you think it does.
Well, because sometimes and this may be different than what you're saying, is that, that they come out of training and they're like defending their own training or their, or the amount of money they've spent or their time at it, or their ego's on false grounds and they're deeply insecure or something.
Yeah.
We don't have to put this part in the book, but I just wanted to ask one general question about, you've been a part of the acting company for 50 years. What does it mean to you, and what role has it played in your life?
Oh, it kept me going for years. I don't mean financially. I mean, professionally, it gave me a goal. It gave me motivation. It made me have some kind of standards. It's interesting. No, it meant a lot. Also, I was part of a community. I wasn't out there on my own, just floundering about, Had tremendous support from John, from Margot, at times when I, really needed it. No, it was very, very, very important. Hugely.
Great. Well, we'll stop, Liz. Thank you.
Interesting. When I was at Central, when we had voice class, we sat or we stood. We sat, we stood. We never moved. When I went to see Peter Brook's White, Midsummer Night's Dream, it blew my mind because they were on trapezes, they were leaping about. It never interrupted the play. It never got in the way of it being crystal clear. As far as I know, they didn't damage their voices. And I thought, I have to change my way of teaching. This is fantastic. And I started to include exercises that involved movement.
Oh, that's interesting.
And at the time, I was, when I was at Bard, I used to ask Jean to come in and help me when I was doing exercises that involved a lot of movement, a lot of running and jumping, and so that I didn't say the wrong thing.
We had a great team.
About-
We were a team teaching for, because I would help them run. It was the messenger would run in with the message, and and so I would help them run, which they had to run different ways because they're different people. So I would do a little movement for actors, but also help them stop.
Well, yeah.
And we would talk about when to breathe, and it was really cool.
Montjoy, I mean, those messengers,
Yeah.
they're so important.
Yeah, they are.
Yeah.
And they always have to read a letter, which is a whole nother skill, right?
Oh,
Yeah.
yes.
Which, or poor Horatio,
Right.
after sitting cold for 2
Yeah.
acts, has to come in and read a letter
Right.
to Hamlet,
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
There's a play in this.
But well, I'm sure there is, all the
all the messengers get together and play.
But all there's video clips of your, and I just remember from watching your warm ups, they were physical. It was, I mean, it was always about the voice and the body integrating,
And a breath going through the body. Yeah.